Hi, everybody. So we have a special guest tonight. So please join me in welcoming Frances Hui from MoMA, Scott Z. Burns, and Annette Benning.
What a nice surprise. So nice to see you, Annette. Phenomenal performance and great film, Scott. I'm going to start with a question for the director. You are a very experienced screenwriter, and you have written other investigation-driven thrillers. And I'm wondering what you see in this CIA report or the making of it that you think that, oh, here's a film. And it's not a sequel, and it's actually a regular feature-length film, 2 hour long. How did you visualize it? We're talking about a very dense and dry document, a room in the basement without windows, offices, conference rooms, and politicians. How did you see this?
What, that doesn't scream political thriller to you? I think as a storyteller, I look for characters, and I think when I met Daniel Jones, and he told me the story not only of the report, which I had read online, so I had an understanding about the CIA's program, but what I didn't fully appreciate was the rigor and the integrity with which Dan had done this, and it really was, that part was spellbinding to me, that there was somebody who would do one of these nameless, faceless jobs and go to work in a basement and would uncover this really horrific piece of our history. And when I started interviewing senators, what they all said to me is, because of the rigor and the integrity with which Daniel did his job, and Senator Feinstein and Senator McCain in particular, all of the senators felt like they had to make sure the report got out. And I was thrilled to find a story of, an American hero. And so for me, that was the choice. It was, I wanted to write about this character's journey and his relationship with the senator who, gave him his marching orders.
And Annette, when you received the screenplay, and how did you think you were going to portray Feinstein? As I said, it's like a lot of offices and conference rooms and chatting, and how were you going to do this?
I thought the writing was really strong, and that the narrative was, it was all about that. It was really all about the story itself and the narrative. And that I thought that, my role was to really try to be as truthful as I could about who Dianne Feinstein is, because that's what the story is. That I would really just be writing the way that Scott had written, which I thought was well done. And Dan Jones is an amazing guy, and he is a very, he's very selfless, and he is really a truly humble person. And he was there with us all the time, and so that made it really helpful, because he had a lot to say about everything, and he had a lot of, he could really help us, and helped me enormously in terms of what was Senator Feinstein like in any given circumstance. So it was really a joy.
I always wonder how actors portray a real life figure. Do you find that you have creative freedom, or you trying to imitate this person as much as possible? How do you approach this?
Well, like I said, I mean, I wanted to do as little as possible so that you would accept that it was her, but that no more than that. And I knew that she was really the only character that anyone really knew, right? She's the only public figure that's in it that, I mean, you see John McCain, and of course it's John. So she's the only person that people could compare, you know, an impression that they had. So I just wanted to do just enough where you accepted that that was her and no more. So that's how I approached it. And I just watched her a lot, listened to her a lot. I'm very familiar with her because I've lived in San Francisco and then lived in California for many, many years. So, but it was great being able to just, watch her and listen to her. I listened to her a lot as well.
The country right now is very divided. I'm wondering, Scott, and also Annette as well, when you were creating this character, whether you thought that you needed to present her in a more multi-dimensional way, like she should have flaws as well, or she should be positive, or should we add something negative about her? How did you treat that?
Well, sort of, my operating principle when I started and whenever I start a project, I make a certain set of rules for myself. And the rule that I had on this was I was going to use the same sort of ethical marching orders that Daniel Jones had to follow, which was this should be bipartisan, and I should use the window that he had into this program. And so I read the report. I pulled as much from the report as I could in the script. And Senator Feinstein is someone who, I felt we did a fair representation of. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't agree with the drone program. And in the movie, she says that, she supports the drone program. And I leave it for the audience to decide what that means, to them. When I spoke to Senator Feinstein's office, they said to me, not surprisingly, that the senator always tries to do what she believes is the right thing, and she's not really driven by party. And I do think that's true. And my own view is she's someone who I have agreed with frequently and disagreed with on occasion very strongly, but I remember when you and I first sat down, we watched this clip of her handing Ted Cruz his ass about gun control, which I encourage you all to go watch.
Has she seen the movie?
Yeah.
Yes, she did see it. She saw it recently in Washington, and she was very pleased. She called me. She liked it a lot. She said, I'm very straightforward. And I think that's true. I think that's true about her. And she also, I think, they take a lot of heat, public servants. I suppose they always have, but maybe particularly now. So to see a movie where we are trying to say, well, this is something actually good came from this, and our public servants, to a degree, really stepped up and made the right thing happen, held people accountable to a degree. So yeah, no, she liked it a lot, and we had a lot of, well, you can talk about that, other people too who are in the film and who were very much affected by these events in their real lives.
Yeah, I mean, Senator Whitehouse was someone I spoke to who also came to that screening in D.C. Ali Soufan, who's portrayed in the movie, who's the FBI agent who did get KSM's identity from Abu Ghraib, is someone who I interviewed extensively, who I think is also a hero. But there were a lot of military interrogators who I spoke to, all of whom, and I think this was, for me, a really important experience. And if there are any people here in the military. I'm sure they will back this up. But, you know, the military really was done a massive disservice by the CIA program. And in, you know, at the same screening the senator was at, there were a lot of generals. One who came and did the Q&A who wept openly in front of a big crowd, saying that this was a giant stain that he didn't feel he would live long enough to see be healed after a lifetime of service and upholding the Uniform Code of Military Conduct, which does not allow for torture. I mean, that's why I put the quote from George Washington at the end. This is against the law, and it's not what the military does. And so there were a lot of really outstanding people who helped me along the way and gave me a lot of really great perspective.
I find it very interesting that you have portrayed the characters in a very clinical fashion. We know something very specific about Jones, but he remains largely opaque. And I think that the only person who has projected emotions and internal struggles is the CIA staff played by Tim Blake Nelson, who's traumatized by the tortures performed. Can you talk about whether it was like a deliberate attempt to avoid personal feelings?
Yeah, look, I wrote the scenes, you know, and I'm sure all of you, whether you're screenwriters or not, can go, oh, you know, interior, Jones's apartment, he stares at the ceiling. You know, breakfast, Jones's apartment, he has uncomfortable conversation with partner about how he's not present in the relationship. You know, we see those scenes a lot, and what I felt very strongly was I wanted to create a sense of claustrophobia for people watching the movie, that this became the mania of this person, and that if I opened the movie up into these personal relationships that he had, I was sort of letting the air out. And I felt, even in doing table reads where I had those scenes, that you kind of wanted to get back to the story, because I think we've seen all those. You know, we've seen the guy who's working too hard or the woman who's working too hard staring into the empty refrigerator. And so once I got rid of that, I also felt like that had to be applicable to the other characters, and that this was going to, that one of the rules was going to be I wasn't going to go home with these characters. The great thing about learning about people like the character that Tim plays, which is based on reality. I mean, Dan told me at one point that he would be around DC and people would walk up to him and say, I worked at the agency, you need to look at emails from 2003. And there were more than one of these people without whom the report would have never happened, because they really steered Dan towards where they felt the greatest transgressions had occurred. And so for me, dramaturgically, it became a great thing to have an opportunity to have a character like that pop up. But that was really where I felt that the emotion had to be. It had to stay, you know, largely in those flashbacks.
Annette, and do you remember conversations you had with Scott, like about the internal side of your character? Are you going to project any of that, or are you going to suppress it?
I don't think we had.
No, I don't think we did that. No, I don't think we did that. We
can do that right here for you if you would like.
I feel that it's interesting what you just said. I hadn't heard you talk about that before. She is someone, I've met her before, briefly, and I've been around her some. She's someone who, in private and in public, I think is pretty consistent. And so, yeah, I felt that what the person that we were seeing somewhat through Dan's eyes was an authentic picture of her, and I do think she's pretty much all business in that way, in a good way. I say that with respect.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the central relationship in the movie is between Dan and the senator, but Adam and I spoke about this quite a bit, that and Adam had come from the Marines, and so he understood the protocols of chain of command, and that you can't walk into the senator's office and pound on the table. And Senator Feinstein, and this isn't true for all senators, requires the staff, if you're a man, to wear a suit and a tie every day if you're going in to see her. And so there were these rules. And so, I made it very clear to Adam that you have to stay within the rules. And that when you create that, it sort of makes for interesting boundaries for actors to emote within. And so, the last scene between the two of them, it's the only time that Senator Feinstein goes to his office. That's a huge gesture. And that's within, the emotional kind of language that those two people shared. That's all they have.
So Annette, for example, when you are portraying Feinstein, do you think that you have to try to come to terms with whether she's pissed off because of the covering up or pissed off because of the torture?
Oh, I think both. Yeah, I think both. And I think that the margin of her behavior and the margin of how she expresses herself is, I don't think she has I think she's controlled. I think that's my impression, and that's certainly the impression that we got from Dan. So that was just sort of how I felt that was my responsibility, is to try to do it in the way that she actually is. She isn't a fiery orator, and she's a very controlled woman. And I kind of like that about the story, personally, just that the fact that it's this kind of person who ended up sort of leading the charge on this particular issue. So I like that, and to a degree, I think part of what the movie is for me is about force of character, that we have these laws, we have checks and balances, we have a system in place, but it takes individuals to sort of step up in certain circumstances in order to enliven the way that our system works. And we're certainly seeing that right now. So in this case, she's someone who follows the rules and goes by the book. And to a degree, that kind of worked. Although she sort of broke the rules a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has, and I think this is what struck me as making this story available as a thriller, is everybody has a box. She's trapped between the politics of the Obama administration, and will she go against, the leader of the party and release this thing? Will she go out on a limb over the objections of Secretary of State Kerry? Dan, Adam's character has another box, Ted Levine, and then you have John Hamm, who's trying to find common ground between all of these people. And that, to me, was sort of how I tried to build this, was what's everybody's box, and how hard can they push against a wall before they violate the idea of their character.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then you will have your chance to ask questions. In the past few weeks, I've been thinking about this film since I saw it, and a lot of things happened in this country in the past few weeks. And suddenly, I just feel like this film is kind of like an urgent tribute to civil servants, people who work in the background, who spend many years working diligently to become the experts that they are. And yet their expertise is often underappreciated, not noticed, not noticed and sometimes sidelined by politicians, and often politicians who have made little investment in those in areas such as intelligence, diplomacy, science, or whatever you can think of. Was it something you thought about when you were making the film?
So yeah, I have a crystal ball at home. No, look, I think, as I said before, the torture part of this story is deeply upsetting and horrifying to me as a citizen of this country. It's really upsetting that these things were done in all of our names. But beyond that, I feel like I have a responsibility as a storyteller and as someone who's trying to entertain as well as inform, to try and find things that are universal. And what struck me as universal in this story was the issue of accountability and of oversight. And, you know, I purposefully wanted the movie to feel a little ambiguous at the end because, yeah, you can go, great, 500 pages did come out. And Jane Mayer, who's a brilliant journalist who, you know, I worked with a little bit on the script at times, you know, Jane said, this is great, they got 500 pages out. And I'm like, yeah, but there's 6,300 pages that are not out, and the pages that we have are redacted. And the cost to Dan, I mean, it really did cost Dan Jones, you know, his career. And so is that okay to take a public servant who is, I mean, if you're leaving town, you want Dan Jones to be your neighbor. Like that's the person you'd like to take care of your house and dog. He is a very conscientious, you know, person. And so I do think we all who were involved in the movie were very aware of a number of things that echo through this moment. You know, if you just look at what the name of the document that came out of this was, it was the McCain-Feinstein Amendment. And so we don't have any amendments anymore that have Republicans and Democrats' names on it. And that to me is a tragedy. And if you go back to the beginning of the movie, you'll find that Dan's marching orders were 14-1. The committee voted 14-1 that he needed to do a deep dive into this program. There's nothing that gets a 14-1 vote anymore. And so those were moments that I felt I wanted to air, because I do think that they have, you know, a real resonance in this moment. And the one last thing I'll say is, you know, Dan is not a whistleblower. Dan Jones is a truth teller, but his job was to go and find out the truth of this program. That was his mission. The current whistleblower is a whistleblower. There was someone buried in the State Department or somewhere in the intelligence community whose identity does need to be protected because we have a law that says that. And I think that that's a really meaningful distinction.
Questions from the audience?
Oh, thanks. Great film. Just one question in your research. Did you come to find, between talking to any of the politicians or anyone that worked in the FBI or CIA, that they came away unfulfilled with regard to having no accountability or no one being fired or no one going to jail? Because between the torture memo, between, you can go back to the lead up to the war in Iraq and the financial crisis, there's basically no accountability across the board with regard to major scandals or issues going on with society today.
Every one of them. Yeah, I mean, people who were a part of this, you know, whether it's Ali Soufan and his feelings about what the CIA did and that no one was held accountable, you know, Dan himself feels that way. You know, the fact that someone who was very involved in the program and destroyed the tapes is now running the CIA instead of being tried for war crimes in Europe, as she has been accused. These are things I think we all have to reflect on about accountability. You know, and I'll just say one last thing to piss you off even further. But when Senator Feinstein stopped being chair, you know, if the movie went on for another 20 minutes, Richard Burr became the chair of the Senate Intel Committee, and one of the first things he did was recalled every copy of the report that had been distributed. So there are only 3 left now.
Can you talk a little bit about the casting of Adam Driver, and what was it about him that made you see him in this role, and what was it like to work with him?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first person I spoke to was you. Yeah, so it was going well. You know, I had a conversation with Steven Soderbergh about what he thought, and I've worked with Steven a lot over the years, and I generally love the casting in his movies, and he had just done Logan Lucky with Adam, and I don't know if you've seen that movie, but if you have, there's no reason to think Adam Driver should be in this movie. But he told me that he felt Adam's work ethic was very much like Dan's, and I didn't know that. I had never met Adam. And I sent him the script, and we went out to dinner, and he said, I guess, what I'd always hoped someone would say, which is, you know, the only thing maybe better than a story you don't know is a story that you think you know, and you learn that you didn't. And I told him, whatever curiosity you have, just bring that every day. And that's really how he operates. And he would call me at 2 in the morning and say, if I switch these 2 words, does it change the meaning? And sometimes it did, and I was like, you can't change those 2 words. But it made me explain it to him. And, you know, he also, you know, like Annette, comes from a theater background, and we needed that because there wasn't a lot of action sequences, and so I needed people who would feel comfortable, you know, really relying on the text.
Scott, hi, over here, in the middle. Okay. I just want to say we're very happy that you exposed the role of the psychologists, and I wondered if you did any research into the background of those 2 men and the ethics, and if you contacted anyone at the American Psychological Association. I'd be really interested in your approach to that part of it.
Can I add something? It's like, aren't psychologists supposed to make people feel good?
Yeah. All right, so obviously you've been sent here to get me in trouble. So look, here's the deal. Both my parents were psychologists growing up. And that does deserve a laugh. So I fully understood how psychology could be weaponized. No. My way into this story was actually through the psychologists, and there was a story by a woman named Catherine Eban in Vanity Fair that began to expose this. And I worked with a number of people associated with that story. I, like you, had grown up believing that psychology existed to help people, not to hurt them. And you know, every psychologist who I spoke to, every military interrogator with a psychological background would say that these techniques never worked. There was no science. And there was a thing called the Hoffman Report, which I'm sure you're aware of, which I read. And, you know, it really outlines the complicity of, and I'm sorry to say this if any APA members are here, that it does outline the complicity of the APA in this program, which they continue to insist is not true. And that just doesn't seem, you know, when I've spoken to people like Jim Risen, who did the hard journalism, I did not, they all tell me that, you know, the APA was involved. And, you know, I did have a conversation with Phil Zimbardo at one point, and I wanted to talk to him more, and he didn't want to speak to me any further. So I tried to do more work, but that was sort of a dead end.
But there were people that quit, and there were people that asked to be transferred. And those, like I think you mentioned, there are unsung heroes in this story that we will never know who they are. But like the Tim Blake Nelson character, the guy who said, this is wrong. There were a lot of people, whether they were in the CIA or they were the medical personnel that were involved, that repudiated it. And we don't know who those names of those people, but there were people that refused to cooperate. They thought it was wrong.
And the APA denied that Jim Mitchell was ever a member, and then it came out that he was. And so, again, I'm a big believer in therapy. So.
Just wanted to go on the record saying that.
Yeah. Just in the event that my therapist is here tonight.
Okay, so I'm a physician myself, and so I really this really reaches hard. First of all, I've got to say a kudos, and that is that we lost McCain, one of the greatest Americans, and we've got you. And what you did is the best acting. There's no award that could be great enough. And the screenplay, and then for Hammer, bringing it to us is just amazing. But I would ask you to consider this. Just as in Germany, they make every kid go to concentration camps to visit, I think that there should be a program that this particular movie is so critical and important, and it speaks to values, and it is so well written and so well acted, simple, easy to understand, that I would hope that you could have a program for school kids. Now my question.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question is this, and it's back to the psychologists. I would like to see a campaign through the universities to remove their degrees. And so that is my wish. And if anybody else is interested, I will do some work. But I am so ashamed they should not have. So do you agree that they should lose their degrees?
Well, again, this goes to a larger issue of accountability, and that to me is, if, I can't sit here and respond to that, but I do feel that what you're bringing up is an issue of accountability, and I will tell you this. Malcolm Nance, who many of you may have seen at times on TV as a commentator, Malcolm was very helpful to me writing the script. And for those of you who don't know, Malcolm was a chief Navy officer, but he created the Sears School in Coronado from which Mitchell and Jessen took the waterboard. And it is, if Malcolm was here, he would say things that, I won't say, but he has absolutely no love loss, and he would definitely agree with what you're saying. I think, to me, the tragedy of that contract is they're indemnified for any legal action, which is sort of an extraordinary thing for the CIA. And, what Malcolm told me is when he saw John Brennan, who he has a friendly relationship with, he said, you should have sued those guys for fraud.
Miss Benning, phenomenal performance. Since the Grifters, I've followed your career, and you've never disappointed. You always show up, perform incredibly, extraordinarily, and you disappear, and the character emerges. And it's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Burns, is that your name? Yeah. Okay. There's another Burns out there making movies, yeah. Brilliant. Extraordinary film. I think he deserves another round of applause, don't you think, everybody? Come on, what a work of art. Amazing, phenomenal. How long did it take you from conception to execution?
About 4 years.
4 hard years.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fast, you know, in this business.
I can tell you the story of the 7 or 8 year movies if you want, but
No, it's courageous of you to do.
thank you.
And the waterboarding scenes are tough to watch, but I think it keeps the pace and the drive, because otherwise it's just talking heads. So you had to have some action. Thank you again. Hard to watch. Brilliant, brilliant movie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
I have a question about this film is also recent, like The Laundromat, and both of those films have quite a few people that wouldn't necessarily want this past dredged up again. And I can imagine with the other films that you've been involved in, there's a lot of other powerful people that would also not like this. And I wondered if you could talk about the dangers of filmmaking and how you deal with any of the fears of retribution.
I feel like I should run. Shit. You know, I guess I feel like, you know, Baldwin said it's the duty of the artist to disturb the peace. And I remember reading that, and I believe that. And, you know, we do have a First Amendment in this country, and I believe in that. I mean, that's, you know, I feel really lucky that on both of those projects, you know, people with a lot to lose and a lot of exposure who are very public facing felt like those were important stories to tell. And so I'm really, you know, I mean, I'll just say this about that. Like, when you make a movie like this, and we shot this movie in 26 days, and if you guys work in the movie business, you know what that means. But everybody, including Annette, worked for scale. And when you know, have that, it you know, you feel like this is what you should be doing.
I believe these are all the questions. Thank you so much, Annette and Scott, and congratulations. And I
Thanks
wish you
for
good luck.
coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.